We're talking coding today, now that we have discussed all that we have to say about planning and testing. Music on the show is from artist Quintas Moreira. I'm going to start winding up some of these personal and weekend review areas so as to make my time a little bit more focused on things I'm doing outside of all my other responsibilities. I want to create more time for my creativity and my business mindset. So eventually these are going to roll off and I'm going to strictly talk about coding because that's really what I wanted to focus on. I just thought that this would be a cool thing to do. And it's actually been really helpful to externalize my thoughts and my feelings about stuff. It makes me feel a lot better. It may help you guys out, but at least it helps me. So I'm going to focus on 3 different things in my personal this week. One is that team culture is critical. If you're on a team that doesn't really work as a team, then it's really it makes your workday a little bit more difficult. And I think this coincides with having personal interaction a lot, because if you have a real good cohesive team, it sort of just naturally happens when you have these personal interactions that are easy. But if your culture is not good, then you don't have as many, and you kind of have to force it, or it feels awkward until you do have those personal interactions. And this happens, I think, with you working remote, although that can be taken care of with tools, just not as easily. So team culture, work on that if you don't have a good one. And I think it's not too difficult. It's just kind of, you just got to go with the flow and express what you're thinking and just kind of make some jokes. Just make everything light, just make it light. People will come around. So I would say in general, that's a good idea. But if you've tried all that stuff and you're not coming away with a good response from any of your team members, I'm not sure what else to do. I think just keeping it light and continuing the conversation and discussion is one way to do it. There are probably others. I don't really know what they are. It doesn't usually take a lot to get a team cohesiveness. Some people are really hesitant to open up, so that's part of the problem. But if anybody else has any good suggestions about what to do for team culture and fit, then let me know. Just hit me up on Twitter at Discode Podcast. And thirdly, it's somewhat difficult to hire into a team that's not really a team, that I like to say is a bad team. Your candidates are gonna sense this if you. I wouldn't say if your team is together when you're talking to the candidate, but that might be it. I think just the way you talk about things when you're answering questions, I think, really conveys whether or not they want to be there. I remember being in a lot of interviews at previous jobs where you're just there to, at the end, you're answering questions of the interviewee, but you're really not making those good answers because you don't really want to talk about it. Part of it is maybe you don't want to answer the same question over and over again, but I think there's another part where you just don't want to talk about it because it's not good. People will figure that out. On to the main section, quality code. Here's a tip that will help you with your day-to-day coding or your team structure around coding, team ideas, team culture around coding. Choose some patterns that work well for you and your team, and stick with them. Don't try and jump on the next thing that someone tells you about. Now, don't stick to them no matter what. You may come across situations where a project, maybe like a tiny little tool project or a library project, doesn't really fit with something you're using on your main project, so don't do that. But find like a handful or just a couple rules you follow or a couple of mantras or patterns you use for certain jobs. So go back and look at those every once in a while, but stick to some for a while. On to the main topic of actually coding. Now, it's important, though, to come up with some of these things we talked about earlier about architecture and testing and those kinds of things, because you want to have that in mind when you get to coding. You don't want to just dive in and start coding, because you got to know how to code in a certain way, because you have all these other things in mind. Let's start with the first thing is components, componentizing your code. I think there are a lot of people struggle with it because they just want to code the thing to get the job done, and it ends up just kind of creating spaghetti code. You want to componentize your code, and as soon as I think a good rule, at least for me, as soon as you solve the problem, go back and look at it and figure out how you can fix it. You know, it's a little awkward, but you can always make it better. You may not be able to make it better perfect, but at least you can make it better. And usually that's by componentizing and modularizing your code. But specifically for components, though, because you want to be able to building block your code, your pieces of logic, so you can reuse them. The second piece I want to touch on is functional coding. I think that this is usually a good idea. I know that it's not a good idea in every single situation, especially when you reach the edges of your logic and your code and your project. But when you're processing that and creating a different output, that's exactly what functional is. And that's what most of coding is. So I think we just need to practice it and see how it works, and don't necessarily force a single tool to do it all the time. I've had problems with that. I've been using streams and things like that, like RxJava and Java streams, to do a lot of things, and a lot of times that's forcing things. But as long as you're being functional, like creating pure functions out of things with minimal side effects, you're going to have side effects no matter what. But if you're pushing those side effects to the edges, then that's a lot easier way to be very good at functional. That brings us to onion architecture or clean architecture. I was introduced to this concept using clean architecture, so that's what I'm going to base this on. And when I was talking about going to the edges, if you look at clean architecture, I've got a article from Uncle Bob. You can just search Uncle Bob clean architecture. You'll find it. The idea is to have your critical business domain, your business domain in the middle. So if you're talking about, an e-commerce store, you're going to have things like items and cart and those kinds of ideas in the center. It's probably not the best example, but that was all I could come up with. And then on top of that, you're going to have some logic, which is your use cases. What are you going to do with those objects? What's required by your system, your functionality, your product to get the job done? And then on top of that, there are multiple different ways to look at it, but this is the way I look at it, is generally you want 3 layers, maybe 2, if it's fairly simple to lump your domain and your use cases in the same. But the third layer outside of your use cases is all the external touching items. So if you have to talk to a database, that's an adapter. If you have to display your information on a website, that's a presenter. You have frameworks and other pieces that you need to talk to the external world with. And that's all on that outside layer. And it's completely decoupled from your business logic. You're creating something that transforms what your product does into some way of talking to other systems with it. That's probably not the best way to put it. I just read the Uncle Bob article on it. It may take a few reads, but it's there. Next is modularity. So this is what I mean by this is figuring out a way to modularize your code, whether it's based on feature, which is a good idea. I think I'm over the fact that you should separate your concerns by, well, concern. There was a long time where everyone wanted to separate their HTML from their JavaScript, from their CSS, and that turns out to be maybe not the best idea, because then you're decoupling things that should work together, if that makes sense. It's hard to wrap your head around what your thing's doing if your CSS is over there and your JavaScript's over there, and I find the same problem with Timeleaf and Spring Boot, because I have to kind of jump back and forth. It'd be nice to have everything just there and it all be one stack, and maybe by feature, so then you can easily follow what's going on in a certain flow. You're not having to piece things together as much. Or maybe you can go by domain. Depends on what your project looks like. By domain might be an idea, but a lot of times, well, most of the time, preferably, you don't have more than one domain in your project. And last thing I'm going to talk about, immutability. It's really required in those high throughput, high availability type applications, microservices that have a lot of traffic. But it's generally a good idea anyway. Use final in Java if you're trying to create some immutability. Otherwise, use some other tools like Project Lombok. But in general, just think about immutability. If you're creating a reference to something and then resetting that reference later, that's just a recipe for bugs. So keep that in mind. And that's all I have for actually coding. The rest of the stuff is your language's syntax, your tooling around your language. I don't think a lot of that stuff is generally that important. I mean, you have to know it and how to use it, but the higher level is more important. So for this week's Week in Review, this is kind of going to be the last one for a while, or at least last in this iteration. I'm going to wind it down. Maybe I'll talk about something next week, but I think that talking about my course, a lot of that stuff that I've been going over is been keeping me accountable, which is great. It expresses, it puts it out there in the world that I'm doing this thing and I'm trying to meet this goal. But at the same time, it was really putting a lot of pressure on me just to try and force things. So I'm going to peel it back a little bit and just do my best. I'm going to do my best in trying to find an audience, and I think I'm closer to it now. But I still haven't figured out the best way to attract an audience. I think I have an idea that I'm going to try, but I still need to see how people teach, and I need to find my avatar, like they call it, or avatars, I suppose it would probably be, because not just one type of person is the type of person that learns Java, which is what I'm focusing on. My blog, again, winding this down, but now I want to say that I have a system that I have, at least in my head. I've nailed it down a little bit. Before I was just kind of blogging about whatever, and I got all these topics. I'm going to focus my blog on one idea, which is helping people who are trying to learn Java for the first time just answer their questions. There are plenty of places where people ask questions about it. It's easy to find them. I found that very quickly, and just take those questions and answer them in a blog. Easy. It may not find a lot of people at the beginning, but if I keep doing it, it's going to, first of all, get easier. They're going to get better, and more people are going to find them over time. I'm also going to continue posting articles on LinkedIn. And what I'm going to do is merge those LinkedIn articles with my blog, basically have the exact same content on both. So I can own the content, but it can also leverage LinkedIn's system, which it really surfaces a lot of visibility into my articles by using articles. So it's been really great. Podcasting, I think I've sort of come across a hurdle a little bit, although I'm sort of coming to the end here with Discode on what exactly I'm going to talk about. I've hit the major topics that I wanted to talk about with this. I think after this, I may transition into specific Java related things. But I also heard from the owner, Charles Maxwood, from devchat.tv, that he was starting a bunch of different podcasts, including one about Java. So I'm going to try and get in on that one just to extend myself a little bit on podcasting, give myself a different piece of experience, work with other people. His format is usually a panel format, so I think it's really important to do things differently a little bit, just to get different perspective, different experience, more learning. So for my kits, I've now got my kid kit. I only added a couple things to it, but it's a nice alliteration. You got coder, cooking, and kid in my kits. It's kit.com/JeffreyFate. And I'll continue to update things as I find things. There probably isn't going to be a lot of change on a lot of these. I just, every once in a while, if I find something that's really cool or really exactly what I needed, etc., I'm going to put it in there. So that's just going to get updated. And the show notes are going to move to just discode.dev because I'm actually using transistor.fm's website feature. It may not happen right away, but it will happen. So the other links will stop working unless I find a way to forward them, but not that many. And I think show notes are only used by a very small number of people, from my understanding. I don't know what my experience is like really yet, because I don't have that data necessarily. But usually people listen to podcasts and they just listen. So shouldn't be a huge deal. All right, guys, this is it for this week's Discode, and I will talk to you in a week.